Hi Ronnie, I hope you are well. So this is going to be a video that covers the first part of Dorian Gray chapter 11, so I'm only going to be going through part 1 of this video, and then part 2 should cover the rest of it. So the focus of this video is going to be mainly on the way that the book that was previously mentioned in the last chapter, how it grew and influenced Dorian, or how it grew on him. So if you remember, it was a book that he kind of described as being a little bit disturbing in terms of how it made him feel, about how it sort of like made him reflect on his thoughts. It definitely seemed to mirror that of what Lord Henry's thoughts are about how one should live, especially as a dandy. And we're also going to review a little bit about what dandyism means again. So the first quote here that I highlighted is talking about what the character or what the book meant to Dorian Gray and how he became sort of obsessed with collecting different versions of it. It says he procured from Paris no less than 9 large paper copies of the first edition and had them bound in different colors so that they might suit his various moods and the changing fancies of a nature over which he seemed at times to have almost entirely lost control. So we see him sort of entering the same lavish lifestyle of the main character that was referenced in the book, which is also similar to Lord Henry's theory of how to live one's life. This also serves as a parallel to Oscar Wilde's lavish lifestyle because he also spent a lot on his wardrobe and living circumstances. In fact, Oscar Wilde's wife that he had met and married, he actually married her mainly for financial reasons. And the moment that they had married and he had access to her finances, it's believed that he actually spent the majority of his wife's money on furnishing for their new house just a few weeks after they just got married. So he was also known for not being very good at saving and not being very good at just saving money. Another really interesting thing to note about this book that is mentioned is there is actually a lot of people believe that Oscar Wilde actually referenced a book that inspired Dorian Gray in the first place. It was a book he himself had read that was written by a French author that kind of spoke about these lavish ideas. So I might actually include another video where someone analyzes and talks about that for you as part of this chapter's reading comprehension activity. So I might do that instead of like just questions directly based on the chapter. And again, we see him feeling like this book is reflecting everything about him. It says, indeed, the whole book seemed to him to contain the story of his own life written before he had lived it. So it's almost like a prophecy as well. He is mirroring the book just as he had mirrored his artwork of the painting that Basil made of him. Another thing that's really interesting is, once again, what I really like about Oscar Wilde is he tends to use prose that kind of coincide with what is being talked about and how it coincides with certain objects that are mentioned. So for example, it says here that Dorian felt he had always the look of, or sorry, this was not how Dorian saw himself. This is a passage where it talks about how this is many years later. This is actually when Dorian ends up like not aging. So he has stayed youthful despite his painting not being youthful. So you'll see that his painting will actually be aging, whereas he himself is not aging, which is really, really creepy, actually, if you think about it. It said he had always the look of one who had kept himself unspotted from the world. This is referring to people in the same city that he's living in who start to realize that there is something strange about Dorian. They hear, even those who had heard the most evil things against him, and from time to time, strange rumors about his mode of life crept through London and became the chatter of the clubs, could not believe anything to his dishonor when they saw him. He had always the look of one who had kept himself unspotted. So unspotted, it kind of reminds me of, like, if you think about a painting that has been unspotted, it's untainted, as a untainted portrait or a photo would be. But in a way, he's a ruse, because he is spotted, but you're just not able to see that because he looks innocent. He looks youthful and vibrant, and not a single bad bone in him. But in reality, all of that is hidden underneath where the portrait is staying in his basement. And this also goes back to, I think I talked about this, maybe I haven't, but this would have been where the first videos that I gave you that discussed the very first chapters and the importance of kind of explaining how youthfulness and beauty were oftentimes synonymous to each other during the Victorian time period, and even today sometimes. But Victorians actually had this common belief that you can actually tell if someone was good or bad just based on how they looked. Like, if somebody was kind, or if someone had a quote-unquote angelic face, or a kind face, or an innocent face, it was oftentimes believed that you were actually good deep down if you looked that way. It's really funny because I believe it was either the Greeks or Romans who also had a similar viewpoint about like how the human mind was synonymous to the human face. But yeah. Oh yeah, I remember. It was like the belief that if you had a beautiful face, you had a beautiful mind, and vice versa. But it shows how sometimes looks can be deceiving. So what's interesting is Oscar Wilde tends to kind of show us both, like, the positives and the negatives of valuing aesthetics. Even though he was definitely a believer of aestheticism and the aesthetic movement, he also was aware of the sort of criticisms on this value of aesthetics. Yeah. And again, another, like, interesting description. They wondered how one so charming and graceful as he was could have escaped the stain of an age that was at once sordid and sensual. So this points out that he has not aged, which is very strange, and he uses the word stain, a sensory detail right there, of, like, again, I think of like a stained portrait or a stained photo. So another thing is he kind of like he becomes self-obsessed with his looks. It says he grew more and more enamored of his own beauty, more and more interested in the corruption of his own soul. He would examine with minute care and sometimes with a monstrous and terrible delight. So these are like opposites of what he looks like on the outside, right? Dorian does not look like a monster, but he might act like a monster, although we haven't seen him directly do anything yet. But we will see. We will see what's in store for him. Yeah, the hideous lines that sear the wrinkling forehead or curled around the heavy central mouth, wondering sometimes which were the more horrible, the signs of sin or the signs of age. He would place his white hands beside the coarse, bloated hands of the picture. So again, his picture is showing that his picture is aging, but he is not. So if you remember in the earlier chapters, he had wished for this to happen. He had wished for his painting to be the one aging and not he himself. And so it's funny because we are seeing that come true for him. But is this really a good thing? Is it good that he got his dream, or is there going to be consequences that are in store for him? He is still worried about himself and whatever harm it causes to him. Whenever he thinks about consequences, it has to be something that's impacting him. Doesn't matter who it impacts. We kind of saw that with his selfishness, with what happened to Sybil. It says, it was his habit to frequent. He would think of the ruin he had brought upon his soul with a pity that was all the more poignant because it was purely selfish. So again, he is still not entirely over what had happened with Sybil, but it's not because he feels bad for her, it's because he feels bad for himself. And so yeah, let's see. The more he knew, the more he desired to know. He had mad hungers that grew more ravenous as he fed them. So this is talking about, again, what says here, that curiosity about life which Lord Henry first stirred in him when he first kind of opened up to him his own views on how to live, what is the ideal way of living, giving into your senses, giving into your sensual pleasures. So what's interesting is it's kind of describing him as a bottomless pit for these pleasures. It also shows the hole or the flaw in Henry's logic that living for pleasure is the best way to live, because it can leave you with deep dissatisfaction. So we see that here as well. His little dinners, in the settling of which Lord Henry always assisted him, were noted as much for the careful selection and placing of those invited as for the exquisite taste shown in the decoration of the table, with its subtle symphonic arrangements of exotic flowers and embroidered cloths and antique plates of gold and silver. This is just one of many examples of this overly embellished description of what the setting looks like. We see here too that Henry is still in his life and is still influencing him. Everything in this chapter is described in an overly embellished, flowery way to imply this overly decorated lifestyle that he is now living. And it's kind of it's funny because I feel like that's actually why this chapter is a little bit drawn out and longer than the others, is because it is drawn out by these beautiful but also kind of pretentious descriptions of beauty, which Oscar Wilde did a fantastic job of doing. I mean, he was not saying that he himself was pretentious, but that in a way this is meant to show the pretentiousness of Dorian living this lifestyle, and being self-absorbed. So another thing is, this kind of talks again about the idea of dandyism and what dandies lived like. It says, fashion by which what is really fantastic becomes for a moment universal, and dandyism, which is in its own way, is an attempt to assert the absolute modernity of beauty, had of course their fascination for him. So if you remember what a dandy is, it's usually a young man who, usually of middle class, deliberately partakes in overdressing himself, participating in lavish lifestyles and hobbies. And this was actually somewhat accurate to some degree on how many dandies were in real life, or I guess maybe caricaturizing how they lived their life. So yeah. Let's see, what else? This part talks about, let's see, the worship of the senses have often... Okay, yeah, so this is going to be where I probably leave off, because this video is getting quite long and I want to create a second part of this video. I haven't even reached the halfway point of this chapter, but just know that this chapter, it is a bit drawn out, but I think that if you think of it this way, the main idea is just going to show how it has changed him. But it says here, the worship of the senses has often, and with much justice, been decried, men feeling a natural instinct of terror about passions and sensations that seem stronger than themselves, that they are conscious of sharing with the less highly organized forms of existence. But it appeared to Dorian Gray that the true nature of the senses had never been understood, and that they had remained savage and animal, merely because the world had sought to starve them into submission, or to kill them by pain, instead of aiming at making them elements of a new spirituality, of which a fine instinct for beauty was to be the dominant characteristic. So what I found interesting about this is that it's actually kind of similar to the ideologies that Sigmund Freud, one of the first psychologists, had about the human psyche. He believed we were all repressing these deep, dark thoughts that were at the bottom of our consciousness in order to achieve order and reason. But in